So our next speaker is Carolyn Tootin from the University of Stirling in Scotland. When Jeet and I were thinking about this program, excited as we were about the science, somehow it seemed off-key to have the last talk still more exciting science when the very subject of our discussions this afternoon is one of the most precariously endangered species in the world. And so we invited Carolyn to come and share with us her immense experience in the field in Africa, and particularly her observations about the recent stresses on the wild chimpanzee populations.
Well, thank you very much. I think I'm very glad to be here, and I definitely would like to thank the organisers for inviting me and for that explanation and introduction. But I think it was a pretty rotten thing to do, to put me on at the end of a long programme. So I hope you'll bear with me. What I'm going to talk about is actually, I think, much easier to absorb because it's a common language. It's what I'm talking about, unfortunately, for most of the part, is the result of human behaviour. And as we're all humans, I think we understand that very easily. I have some requests at the end that I would like to have you lot isolate the genes for compassion and empathy, and I think we could get it past the ethics committee to pop those into a lot of other people. But let's stay serious and get to the end of the programme. Well, we've been hearing a lot about chimpanzees, and I'm just going to talk about the ones that are out in the wild, which, having listened to all these talks and understood, I would estimate about 7.5% of what I've heard this afternoon, I think these wild chimpanzees are going to become really, really important, because all that we're talking about, evolution, function, I mean, that's happening out there in the wild. Okay, we can do a lot of testing, we can do a lot of probing about cognition, and it's very important and interesting complementary information. But if we don't know the range of ecological challenges that chimpanzees are facing in the wild, if we don't know how they respond to things that have happened in the past, climate change, we know the Congo Basin forests, which today are enormous and fairly continuous, have been at various times, much more recently than the timescale we're talking about, reduced to isolated blocks, although what's happened in the past is not the same as what's happening now. So I think, I'm soliciting you not only to invite a speaker on conservation biology, but to really integrate at the heart of the genome work and the genome project a commitment to conservation. And it's interesting to think about, I'm sorry, I'm ad-libbing and not even giving you my talk for the moment. I'll get onto it. It's interesting looking at who's been talking about differences and who's been talking about similarities. Because clearly differences are the way you're going. You're saying this is what's going to advance our investigations and develop our hypotheses and allow us to test them, is to really pinpoint the differences between humans and chimpanzees in terms of the genome. I think the message, please don't forget it, because we sort of started hearing that it was a bit of history. Don't forget to tell people how similar the chimps are as well, because I think that's the strong conservation message. So I solicit a return to the 99%. Okay, well, we know a lot about, and more about genes, but we don't actually know how many chimpanzees are left in the wild. The best estimates are between 100,000 and 150,000. What we do know, even if we can't put precise numbers on it, is that there is very dramatic declines going on across the species range and at really quite terrifying rates. We can do declines because you do repeat censuses using the same methods separated by 10, 15 or 20 years. And while it is, as I say, difficult to translate those into precise numbers of chimpanzees, you can do the declines much better. And they're looking like 50% to 60%. And it's not just the populations on the fringe of the geographical distributions or in the habitats where humans are occur very densely, and so there's much more direct conflict. These sizable declines are now affecting what had always been considered to be the last bastion of the great apes, the gorillas, the bonobos, and the chimpanzees, those wonderful tropical rainforests of the Congo Basin in West Central Africa. So, the decline is going on. Over the last 2-3 decades, it's carrying on very much the same, and we don't yet know how to stop this decline. Conservation has not yet come up with the silver bullet or the magic strategies. Just very quickly, this is actually an out-of-date map. Chimpanzees occur across tropical Africa with the taxonomic divisions, which have moved from 3 when this map was drawn to 4 now, related to geographical isolation. So West Africa, the green ones in the middle are the Central African chimpanzees, and the grey ones, the Eastern chimpanzees, and the new subspecies, I don't have another hand for the thing, but the splodges in the middle between Nigeria, Cameroon. Chimpanzees occupy a range of habitats. Okay, it's a fairly narrow band of Africa, that, but in fact you're looking at dry, open, savanna-dominated habitats in the extreme north west of the distribution, down to the equatorial band of evergreen tropical rainforest. And these different habitats present really quite different challenges to the chimpanzees. Recent research, both in the genetics that we've been hearing about, but also population genetics and other approaches, as well as the behavioral research that Professor Matsuzawa talked about, has emphasized diversity within the species Pantroglodytes, and this diversity is expressed in a lot of different ways. So again, it sort of feeds in a bit to the phenome idea as well. How do you cope with variation within even a subspecies in terms of defining the features and everything else? Just very rapidly, and fortunately some of this has already been done. This slide and the next one are chimpanzees of the same community, the same social group in Tanzania at Gombe. And if you can just keep that face in mind, you see they look quite different, which is great when you go out there as a young student, because you can recognize to learn those individuals very quickly. You can tell them all apart as time goes by, but some things are very striking. This is a chimpanzee from Gabon. It's not such a good photograph because they're not as well habituated, and it's to remind me to tell you that I've spent the last 22 years, had the privilege to spend the last 22 years working in Gabon, and this talk will inevitably be a little bit biased towards that country. I'm sure I'm saying too much. The other thing, I can go very quickly here because we heard about the cultural variation in populations from 2 speakers previously. This is just, again, to say that this diversity, it's ecological, related to habitat, it's all kinds of physical features and behaviors, and here the tool using that is found in some populations, not found in other groups of chimpanzees, even though we've shown that there are enough tools and nuts and everything else. It's not ecological limitations that stop these behaviors occurring, but they're present, absent, or different, depending on which population of chimpanzees you're looking at. So to go on briefly, and I'll go through this quickly because the threats, I think everybody knows about them. There are 3 major threats, major classes of threats. There's loss of habitat, which can either be deforestation or altering habitats to a point where they are no longer, they will no longer support chimpanzee populations. There's hunting and there's disease. So I'll go through these quickly, one after the other. Deforestation and modification of habitat to a point where it no longer is viable for chimpanzees is happening where human populations are the most dense. And it's quite interesting because I think, well, if you look at human populations are denser outside the tropical forest region of Africa. The tropical forest does not seem to be a very hospitable habitat for humans. Historically and now, human population density is low. You get a lot of these really quite nasty diseases. And chimps and gorillas do quite well in these habitats at the moment because there's more habitat than there is in areas where humans are more more numerous and where the humans need to clear a lot of forest for agricultural use. So this is the major threat in West Africa and in the East African countries of Uganda and Tanzania. In the Congo Basin, this is the major threat, hunting. And the hunting pressure has increased enormously over the last 10 years, and it's not a result of there being a lot more people. It's because of an economic change in the region which changed the whole way that logging happened. Because logging, although it's selective and doesn't destroy the habitat in this country, we're only talking about 10% of loss of whatever measure of forest you use, basal area, canopy cover, or ground cover. Logged forest, if it's just being logged, remains suitable habitat for chimpanzees and gorillas. But the problem is that logging creates roads, and these roads allow, clearly the loggers can't, they can in Canada, but in Gabon they wouldn't imagine going in with helicopters to avoid having to build roads, but roads are an essential part of logging. They need to get into the forest and they need to transport the logs out because these logs are being cut almost entirely for export. So these roads at the same time are allowing hunters to move into forests that were previously protected by their isolation, and equally the transport of the logs allows the meat to be moved to urban markets where it's sold. But the economic change was, again, it's one of these things where you've got to, if you're concerned about conservation, you've really got to keep on your toes, and nobody saw this one coming. It was a devaluation of the local currency, which is shared by most of the countries in the Congo Basin. And just overnight, the wood was worth twice as much as it had been before because it's being exported, but your costs have been cut by half through the devaluation. So we were all happy as sandboys in Gabon, and Sally Lamb's here, and she spent as long as I have in Gabon. And we all felt that this was going to be, we called it the natural sanctuary. First time World Wildlife Fund came to Gabon, they said, oh, we'll put a fence around the country and make the whole place a national park. It's fantastic. For elephants, for all large mammals, it's really amazing. And yet, this changed very quickly with a macroeconomic decision. So conservation is difficult, if I haven't said that already. So this is just these trucks that are now taking logs, and the railway behind, actually, in Gabon, there's a railway that was built mainly to facilitate logging as well. And these provide access routes for both logs and for meat. For chimpanzees and for gorillas, there's also the problem, usually a byproduct of hunting for meat. Meat's the major objective. But if mothers are killed and dependent infants are then captured, these infants will be offered for sale because they're not worth their weight as far as food's concerned, but they do have a certain value as pets. When I first went to Gabon in 1980, we went to address what was seen then as the major threat to ape populations in the region, which was the constant demand by zoos for young gorillas, and the demand of biomedical facilities for chimpanzees has sort of already begun to wane a bit. But these threats change quite regularly over time. International conventions and laws have now more or less stopped international trade in live chimpanzee infants. Another thing, that proviso that genetics could also help, perhaps by challenging some of these dubious cases where countries claim that chimpanzees are captive born, and you people now have the capacity to test that, and anyway, that's a bit of an aside. But there's still a local market, because these little chimps, people think they're saving them by buying them. In fact, of course, it's if you're slightly detached from that individual, it's absolutely catastrophic, because if it becomes economically interesting to sell baby chimpanzees, this is the most devastating kind of hunting that can happen. Females are being targeted and infants being removed from populations. So national laws exist in all chimpanzee habitat countries that theoretically protect chimpanzees, but enforcement is very hard. The capacity is not adequate. It's a real problem, but many projects, this, that, and the other, and a lot of very determined individuals have opened up sanctuaries and to allow the local authorities to actually apply the law and confiscate baby chimpanzees and baby gorillas that are being offered for sale. And in turn, these sanctuaries are now creating another problem that we can't ignore. I mean, there are probably 1,000 chimpanzees in captivity in habitat countries, and their long-term future is often very insecure. And 1,000 is a significant number of chimpanzees, so again, we should be thinking about how to deal with that. Disease. In Gabon, I work for the Centre International de Recherche Médicale de Franceville, a medical research center, Gabonese institution, and that has created a multidisciplinary atmosphere where from the first day we were there, we were collecting fecal samples for parasite analysis. And that's been a very interesting environment, and through the time we've been there, the non-invasive samples for genetic testing have come up. And it's something that's very, very positive, collaborations between field teams, both in institutions, as at Leipzig, very positive, and also in the field. And it was easier for us in Gabon because we had an in-country facility with good capacity for medical research. And over the years, we've been able to help virologists when working on retroviruses, naturally occurring retroviruses, parasitologists, and various other projects. But despite all that, I mean, it is a problem that very little's known about the natural levels of disease in wild ape populations, because you can only do a certain amount through non-invasive samples, and clearly there are problems becoming any more invasive than that. But the problem with disease has really sort of snowballed again and taken us by surprise, and for the moment remains something that we're almost embarrassed about because we don't have the responses, we don't know what to do about it. But we do now know that in Gabon and neighboring Congo, since 1994, there have been, I think, 6 or 7 outbreaks of Ebola in the human population. The first indication that chimpanzees and Ebola was fatal for chimpanzees came from Ivory Coast, from Christophe Busch's site, where chimpanzees were known to have died of it. But what's happened here is a much bigger scale. There's a large area in northeastern Gabon where we did censuses in the early 1980s, and these censuses were repeated partially in the early 1990s and then again late 1990s to 2000, because it's part of the new national park system, and it was sampled much more intensively in the year 2000. And the results suggest that chimpanzee and gorilla populations have dropped virtually to zero over an area of 20,000 square kilometers. And it's believed, because this is an isolated area where there's no logging, very, very limited hunting, that this is almost entirely due to Ebola. And, you know, all we can do for the moment is encourage people in the field to work with multidisciplinary teams doing this, to recognize that when the human epidemic occurs, it's crisis management, and you can't always ask the right questions and put an emphasis on gorillas and chimpanzees when people are dying, to look for novel ways to integrate public health concerns with wildlife concerns and all this, but we don't have any answers to this. I'm taking much too long, sorry, I'll speed up. This whole range of different threats, chimpanzees are particularly vulnerable to them because they reproduce so slowly, they mature slowly. Data on reproductive success from wild populations suggests that females are only managing just over replacement, with about 2.5 offspring on average surviving to adulthood. So even if, you know, it's a minor impact on a population, a decline, their capacity to recover and bounce back from these declines is really very limited. So for the last section, it's to try and be a bit more upbeat and say, well, what can we do about it? What's going on? What are people doing? What's working? The solutions, as I said, there are no magic ones. It's a complex situation. You've got to analyze the causes of threats and really look at what strategies are likely to mitigate them. But, so, you know, what I'm saying is it's a site-specific review to come up with the best solutions. For the less densely populated countries of the Congo Basin where there are still large expanses of chimpanzee habitat, intact chimpanzee habitat, then large national parks, large protected areas are the way to go. That's the most important thing to do first. And the advantage, of course, of these parks is that they're not only protecting chimpanzees, but they're protecting the whole environment in the largest sense of those chimpanzees. And in theory, if all goes well, they're not just protecting viable populations, but they're also to some extent protecting ecosystem processes and things like evolution in action. I mean, you know, it's the ideal way to protect nature, wilderness. There are some very critically endangered populations, and some of these are very, very special populations. They're the populations that we know the most about. They're the chimpanzees at Gombe in Tanzania, where a very small, hard-edged national park is now struggling to protect probably half as many chimpanzees as there were 25 years ago. There's Bosu, where the Japanese researchers have done a fantastic job, and it's thanks to their presence and interest that those chimpanzees remain, but there's no way around the fact that they are very vulnerable. And enormous efforts have to be made to try and protect those chimpanzees, because these populations they're our library of chimpanzees. If we have to start again and say, okay, well, let's wait until we've got a population where we know who the grandmother was and who the second cousin and how many children her mother had and how she brings her infants up and all these things, whether she uses her left or right hand, I mean, we can't afford to let those populations go. But as Professor Matsuzawa said, there's expensive and difficult solutions, building corridors, creating forest corridors. It's ambitious, and who would do it except the people who know those chimpanzees so well and are going to go out there and plant 7,000 trees. What he didn't say, he said to me this morning, is that there's extremely high mortality in those trees, and they have to start replanting again. But it has to be done, those kind of projects, and I think, again, we have to support it. They're living databases, those guys, so let's not lose them. Then, just very briefly, the orphanage sanctuary problem. There are some rays of hope as well. This is a project in Congo that has successfully reintroduced some of the bushmeat orphans that were not kept in captivity for long and were able to be put back into the forests that they came from. And now there are guidelines for this kind of exercise, and there were both obviously strict health controls, but also genetic data taken to make sure that these were compatible with the chimpanzees from that area, so to avoid any genetic pollution, which people are beginning to get upset about. But very cost heavy. I mean, these chimpanzees equipped with radio collars, they're followed daily. Project's now in its 5th year since release, and there's reproduction. There's 73% survival of the released individuals. About 37 chimps have been released. The advantage of this is that these chimpanzees, releasing these chimpanzees has meant that there's a presence there and there's a protection there. So there are a lot of spin-off benefits, and it's also fantastic to have these potential education facilities available in habitat countries. Lots more research. All the field sites should, we should all keep awake to what can be done, get new techniques into the field sites, new collaborations, new exchanges of information going as soon as we can. This is collecting hair and fecal samples for genetic analysis on a gorilla nest in this case. And this a way to try and address the disease issues with both retroviruses and Ebola, collecting samples of blood from animals that are already been killed and on sale for bushmeat. It has to be done very sensitively, very carefully, so as not to encourage any more killing of monkeys. And it's coupled with education of the people who are touching, handling these potentially quite dangerous animals. And running right through, of course, education involving people from the habitat countries. Here, a group of students being taken out of the National University into the field for the first time, and they get really excited about it. And it's education is always frustrating because it takes a while to train people up, but it's working extremely well. And at another level, this is villagers living close to national parks. These are the guys that lose out on the creation of national parks because they lose access to some resources they had before. Their activities are a bit more curtailed and restricted. So to try and make sure that protected areas create jobs for them, either through ecotourism programs or through collecting data or through being guides for tourists. In fact, these 4 here were working at the time as research assistants for Derek Denton, who is offering elephants in the Lopi Reserve a choice of a number of salt. This is right at your site. So I'll stop there. Thank you.